If your campaign plan involves Step 1, do something bold. Step 2, improvise wildly until it works. Congratulations, you've just reinvented Gallipoli. Welcome back to the Fokker Lab podcast, where we talk intelligence, strategy, leadership, and discernment, and occasionally point at century-old disasters so we don't have to learn everything the hard way. Today, we're diving into Gallipoli, the First World War campaign that somehow combined a strategically interesting idea with mission creep, trial and error planning, and execution so bad it should be studied under what not to do in every staff college on Earth. Let's set the stage. It's 1915. World War I is stuck in a miserable trench stalemate in Europe. The Allies are looking for a way to break the deadlock, relieve pressure on Russia, and hit the weakest member of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. On paper, the idea is simple and quite clever. Force the Dardanelles, threaten Constantinople, knock the Ottomans out of the war, open sea lanes to Russia, and reshape the strategic map. Bold? Yes. Crazy? Not necessarily. Several historians and analysts note that the concept of attacking through the Dardanelles had strategic logic. The problem was everything that happened next. The initial plan was a naval campaign. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, pushed a scheme to send a fleet of older battleships through the straits, blast their way past forts and minefields, and park heavy guns in front of Constantinople until the Ottomans lost their nerve and sued for peace. It was basically 19th century gunboat diplomacy upgraded for a 20th century industrial war. You might recognize the vibe. We'll shock them with a show of force, they'll fold, everyone goes home. It's the military version of thinking your strongly worded email will end the conflict. Reality did not cooperate. The naval attacks ran into well-placed mines and determined coastal defenses. Ships were sunk, losses mounted, and the fleet could not force the straits. The assumption that the Ottomans would panic and surrender evaporated on contact with actual Ottoman gunners, actual mines, and an actual commander named Mustafa Kemal, who was not interested in playing the role of easily intimidated side character. This is where mission creep slithers in. The original idea, naval push, no boots on the peninsula. Then, when the Navy failed to punch through, the mission quietly expanded. Now the Army would land on Gallipoli to capture the high ground, silence the guns, and clear the minefields so the Navy could, eventually, do what it had originally promised to do. In one historian's words, the Army was initially framed almost as a support element for a naval show of force, and then within days became the main effort required to solve problems the naval plan had created. That's textbook mission creep. Add tasks to the original mission to fix the fallout of an underthought plan without redesigning the plan itself. The Mediterranean Expeditionary Force that went in wasn't even configured for assault landings. They were sent with shipping priorities in mind, not amphibious warfare requirements. They didn't have the right logistics, equipment, or doctrine for complex landings under fire. Yet the mission evolved from support the Navy to execute a major joint amphibious operation, with almost no meaningful adjustment to the force or concept. You might be thinking, that sounds familiar. It should. In modern campaigns, we do this all the time. We start with a narrow mission, pressure a regime, secure a site, execute limited strikes, and then, as resistance appears and reality pushes back, we tack on additional tasks, build governance, stabilize the region, shape public opinion, train forces, reform institutions, engage in nation building. Each new task solves a piece of the previous gap, but the original strategy never gets rewritten. It's trial and error campaign design. Try something, see what breaks, add a new line to the mission statement, repeat. The Gallipoli article I wrote over 20 years ago argues that this is exactly what happened in 1915. Campaign planning by trial and error instead of coherent strategy. Operationally, the landings at Gallipoli were a masterclass in how terrain, underestimation, and planning failures can converge. When Allied troops finally went ashore, they ran into steep, broken ground, entrenched Turkish defenders, and a complete mismatch between their assumptions and the actual environment. Instead of rapid movement inland to decisive objectives, they got stuck in narrow beachheads and ridges. Very quickly, Gallipoli started to look like a smaller, equally miserable version of the trench warfare disaster they had hoped to bypass in France and Flanders. The campaign turned into a static fight of attrition in terrain that favored the defenders. Maps were poorly understood. Intelligence was underused or misinterpreted. Logistical and medical planning was inadequate, and artillery support was negligible compared to what the situation demanded. Analysts who've gone back through the campaign list a familiar set of sins: lack of realistic goals, no coherent plan, use of inexperienced troops, underestimation of the enemy, incompetent local command, and a big dose of overconfidence on top. One historian summed up Gallipoli as hubris, blood, and suffering laid over systemic planning failures. So, what's the lesson here beyond don't invade Gallipoli in 1915? First, strategy and mission design must stay connected. The root indictment behind the phrase failed trial and error campaign planning is that the Allies kept adjusting the mission tactically without revisiting the basic strategy. Is this the right way to achieve our ends with the means we have? When the naval plan clearly couldn't succeed, they didn't step back and say, we need a different approach to knocking out the Ottomans. They said, we need the army to fix the Navy's problem. When the landings bogged down, they didn't say, this peninsula may not be the right decisive point. They said, we need more attacks and more persistence. It's like trying to fix a fundamentally flawed PowerPoint deck. By changing fonts and colors, the content doesn't make sense, but rather than rewriting the argument, you keep tweaking slides. Second, mission creep is often the result of failing to make hard choices up front. Clear strategy forces you to say no. No, we're not going to do that with these forces. No, we're not going to pretend this naval demonstration can magically topple a government. No, we're not going to launch an amphibious assault with units and logistics arranged for something entirely different. When you don't make those hard calls in planning, you end up making even harder calls in crisis, usually under fire, with worse options and more blood on the ground. The Gallipoli campaign shows a pattern of leaders hedging, trying not to commit fully to a land campaign, then doing it halfway, hoping incremental moves would be enough. Third, you can't trial and error your way through strategic ends and means. Experimentation is vital at the tactical level. You absolutely want units testing techniques, exploring new approaches, iterating on small problems. But when your entire campaign design is basically, we'll start here and see what happens, you've slipped into a dangerous place. Several analyses of Gallipoli note that there was no clear, shared understanding of what success would look like, how each phase linked to that success, or what the thresholds were for stopping, shifting, or aborting the mission. In practice, that meant the campaign stumbled forward until the only politically acceptable option was withdrawal. It's worth saying the casualties were staggering. The Gallipoli campaign cost roughly 250,000 casualties on each side. It reshaped national narratives in places like Australia and New Zealand and left scars on British and French politics. It forced resignations, coalition changes, and long shadow debates about Churchill and high command judgment. The price tag for trial and error campaign planning was not abstract. So how do we drag this back into your life if you're not planning amphibious operations on the Dardanelles? Most of us run mini Gallipolis in our organizations and personal leadership. We start an initiative with a vague, bold idea, underthink the planning, underestimate resistance, and then, when the first attempt falters, we add more tasks instead of revisiting the strategy. We tack on training, communication, culture change, innovation labs, and new metrics, all to prop up a plan that never really matched our ends, means, and environment in the first place. We're doing mission creep. We're doing trial and error campaign design. We just call it being agile or iterative. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's camouflage for not doing the hard thinking at the beginning. The point of this episode isn't to say never adjust your mission. It's to say adjust it on purpose, with clear links back to your ends and your means, instead of drifting into a different mission because you're reluctant to admit the first one doesn't work. Gallipoli is what happens when you bolt more and more stuff onto a flawed concept and call that determination. This is the Fokker Lab podcast. Today, we used a World War I disaster as a mirror to ask whether our campaigns, military, organizational, or personal, are coherent, or whether we're hoping trial and error plus courage will eventually turn a bad plan into a good outcome. If you're currently leading something that feels suspiciously like, we'll start here and see what happens, it might be time to pause and ask, is this strategy or is this mission creep with nice branding?